The Great Depression and the New Deal, America's darkest hour. The story of the Great Depression begins in the glittering haze of the 1920s, a decade that America would forever remember as both a promise and a warning. In New York City, the streets of Manhattan bustled with bright lights and endless optimism. Jazz poured from the doors of Harlem clubs, stock tickers clattered in brokerage offices, and on Wall Street, fortunes seemed to appear overnight. It was called the Roaring Twenties, a time when ordinary families bought their first radios, when automobiles rolled off assembly lines in Detroit and transformed daily life, when advertising convinced a new middle class that prosperity had no limits. Credit was cheap, speculation was rampant, and the American dream seemed to stretch higher than the skyscrapers piercing the clouds above. But beneath the music and champagne bubbles, cracks in the foundation had already begun to spread. Factories overproduced while farmers struggled under crushing debt. Many workers saw little of the wealth their bosses flaunted. Banks lent recklessly, allowing ordinary citizens to borrow money and pour it into stocks they could not afford. The stock market, once a measure of business health, became a casino of speculation. Newspapers declared that prosperity was permanent, that America had conquered the cycles of boom and bust. Few wanted to hear warnings that the good times could not last. Then came October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. The morning began with panic. Traders swarmed the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, desperate to sell before prices collapsed further. Stock values plummeted with terrifying speed. Tickers fell hours behind, unable to keep up with the chaos. Outside on Wall Street, thousands gathered, staring at the financial heart of the world unraveling before their eyes. Some investors lost everything in a single day. The newspapers captured headlines of ruin, of fortunes vanished as though erased by the stroke of fate. Across the country, banks that had poured money into the market suddenly found themselves unable to collect. A cascade of failures began as one collapse triggered another. For years, Wall Street had been a symbol of endless growth, but now it became a graveyard of broken dreams. In New York, brokers wept openly on sidewalks. Rumors of suicides spread as men who once boasted of untouchable wealth faced ruin overnight. In small towns far from Manhattan, families read in disbelief as the panic reached them through radio and newsprint. They had not speculated in stocks, but they would pay the price nonetheless. Factories slowed production, businesses cut wages, and within weeks, unemployment soared. By the winter of 1930, the crash had spread far beyond Wall Street. Nearly 5,000 banks collapsed within just a few years, wiping out the life savings of millions. In a time before deposit insurance, families who had trusted their local banks suddenly found their money gone forever. Fathers returned home with empty pay envelopes, mothers pawned heirlooms to put bread on the table. On the streets of major cities, long lines formed outside soup kitchens. People who had once considered themselves middle class now stood with tin cups, waiting for a ladle of thin broth. It was not just a financial collapse, it was a collapse of confidence. The very idea of the American dream was shaken. Farmers, already reeling from low crop prices, now faced foreclosure as banks seized their land. Factories shuttered, leaving entire towns jobless. In Detroit, thousands of men gathered outside automobile plants, waiting for jobs that never came. In Chicago, families crowded into makeshift shantytowns built from scrap wood and tar paper. They would come to be known as Hoovervilles, a bitter reference to President Herbert Hoover, whose policies many believed had failed them in their hour of need. America was not simply in recession, it was in freefall. From the stock market crash to the collapse of banking, from urban centers to rural farms, the nation spiraled deeper into despair. It was the beginning of a decade that would test not only the economy, but the endurance, resilience, and spirit of the American people. If you want more stories of history's turning points, don't forget to subscribe to Epoch of Change. Your support helps us create more cinematic history and ensures you don't miss the next episode. As the economy collapsed, nature delivered a second and even crueler blow. Across the Great Plains, from Texas to Oklahoma, Kansas to Colorado, years of over-farming and drought turned fertile soil into dust. By 1931, winds howled across the plains, ripping topsoil from the land and hurling it thousands of miles east. Farmers who once grew wheat and corn now watched as their crops shriveled and died in barren fields. Then came the storms. Towering black clouds of dust rolled across the horizon like moving mountains, swallowing farms, towns, and even the sun itself. Families nailed blankets across windows and stuffed rags under doors, but nothing could stop the fine grit from seeping in, coating every dish, every bed, every lung. Children coughed through the nights, animals suffocated in barns. In some places, day turned to night as the sky disappeared beneath the storm. Newspapers called it the Dust Bowl. Families who had worked the land for generations abandoned their farms, piling their lives onto battered trucks and setting out westward in search of work. They became migrants, often called Okies, regardless of which state they came from, traveling toward California, where fields of fruit and cotton offered the hope of jobs. But hope often turned to disappointment. Wages were low, competition was fierce, and locals sometimes greeted the newcomers with suspicion or outright hostility. In cities, conditions were no better. By 1932, 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. In places like Cleveland, more than half the city's workers had no jobs. Shantytowns, Hoovervilles, sprawled across abandoned lots, riverbanks, and city parks. Families scavenged for tin, cardboard, and old lumber to build shelters. In New York, men sold apples on street corners, not for profit but for survival. In Chicago, children fainted from hunger in classrooms. For millions, survival meant soup kitchens and breadlines. President Herbert Hoover, a man once celebrated as a self-made millionaire and humanitarian, became a symbol of failure. He believed deeply in voluntary action and limited government, insisting that prosperity was just around the corner. He encouraged businesses not to cut wages and urged charities to do more. But as the crisis deepened, such measures felt hopelessly small. His decision to balance the federal budget by cutting spending only deepened the suffering. Critics mocked him as cold and indifferent, blaming him for the shanty towns that bore his name. By 1932, desperation turned to anger. Protests broke out across the country. Farmers blockaded roads, refusing to let food leave their counties while their own children starved. In Washington, D.C., thousands of World War I veterans, known as the Bonus Army, marched to demand early payment of bonuses promised to them. They built camps near the Capitol, a city within a city, only to be driven out by soldiers with bayonets and tear gas. Images of veterans, men who had once fought for America, now beaten down by its government, shocked the nation and eroded faith in Hoover further. Hunger gnawed at the edges of American society. Churches and charities were overwhelmed. Teachers reported students coming to class barefoot, without lunch, their eyes hollow from malnutrition. In many rural towns, entire schools closed because they could not afford to pay teachers. For the first time in modern history, Americans questioned whether their government could protect them from collapse. If you believe stories like this need to be told, please subscribe to Epoch of Change. It encourages us to create more history documentaries and helps others discover these forgotten struggles. By the end of 1932, faith in Hoover had all but vanished. The nation yearned for leadership, for hope, for someone who could lift them out of despair. On the horizon, one man emerged who promised exactly that: Franklin Delano Roosevelt. By the fall of 1932, America stood at the breaking point. Factories lay silent, crops rotted in the fields, and the nation's spirit was cracked under the weight of despair. Into this darkness stepped Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man whose own life had been tested by tragedy. Stricken by polio in 1921, Roosevelt lost the use of his legs, but he never surrendered his resolve. He emerged as a symbol of resilience, projecting optimism when the country craved hope. On the campaign trail, he promised a new deal for the American people, words that carried no specific plan but radiated assurance that change was coming. On Election Day, Roosevelt triumphed in a landslide, winning 42 of 48 states. The message was clear. America wanted bold leadership, yet as he prepared to take office, the nation teetered on the brink of complete collapse. In the winter of 1933, banks failed daily. People rushed to withdraw savings before vaults were emptied. Businesses shuttered by the hour. Roosevelt knew that inaction would mean ruin. On March 4th, 1933, he delivered his inaugural address. His voice rang out across the National Mall, carried by radio into homes across the country. "The only thing we have to fear," he declared, "is fear itself." Those words were more than rhetoric. They were a rallying cry. The AAA sought to stabilize crop prices by paying farmers to reduce production, giving rural families a lifeline. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration provided direct aid to the unemployed, something Hoover had resisted. But Roosevelt's genius was not only in policy, but in communication. He understood that in times of crisis, people needed to feel heard and included. Through his famous fireside chats, he spoke directly to Americans via radio. Families gathered around their living room sets as Roosevelt explained in plain language what the government was doing and why. His calm, reassuring tone made millions feel as if the president himself was in their home, guiding them through the storm. People deposited their savings, businesses took cautious steps forward, and the word hope re-entered the national vocabulary. If you want to keep these stories alive and support more history documentaries, subscribe to Epoch of Change. But for the first time in years, America had a leader who dared to act and dared to hope. The New Deal had only just begun. As Roosevelt's first wave of reforms began to stabilize the nation, it became clear that temporary relief would not be enough. America needed jobs, infrastructure, and a vision of recovery that reached into every town and farm. The New Deal entered its next phase. Not just rescuing banks or offering emergency relief, but rebuilding the very framework of American life. In 1935, Congress passed legislation that expanded Roosevelt's efforts dramatically. At the heart of this new push was the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. This program became one of the most ambitious public works efforts in history, employing millions of Americans in projects that reshaped the nation's landscape. Roads stretched across states where dirt paths once lay. Bridges rose over wide rivers, connecting communities that had long been isolated. For many, this was proof that the New Deal valued not just survival, but the enrichment of American spirit and identity. Meanwhile, in the Tennessee Valley, a bold experiment unfolded. The Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, brought electricity and flood control to one of the poorest regions in the country. Families who had lived by candlelight saw their homes illuminated for the first time. Dams harnessed rivers, preventing floods that had destroyed farms for generations, while creating jobs and providing cheap power. The TVA symbolized the New Deal's reach, a vision of government not as a distant overseer, but as a partner in progress. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the New Deal came in 1935 with the passage of the Social Security Act. For the first time, the United States created a system of retirement pensions, unemployment insurance, and aid for the disabled and dependent children. The law recognized that economic security was not a privilege for the few, but a right for all citizens. To millions who had lived through the despair of joblessness and old-age poverty, Social Security was a promise. The government would not abandon them in their most vulnerable years. Yet the New Deal was not without enemies. Conservatives accused Roosevelt of reckless spending and warned that the expansion of federal power threatened the very foundation of American liberty. Business leaders feared rising taxes and tighter regulations. In the Supreme Court, justices struck down key programs, ruling them unconstitutional. At the same time, critics from the left insisted Roosevelt had not gone far enough. Figures like Huey Long of Louisiana demanded wealth redistribution, rallying under the slogan, "Share our wealth." Others pushed for stronger protections for labor and more radical reforms. Roosevelt, caught between these pressures, navigated with political skill, but not without fierce battles. By 1936, the New Deal had transformed the federal government into a central player in American life. It had given people jobs, built infrastructure, created safety nets, and restored a sense of dignity. But the Depression was not yet over. Unemployment remained high, and the fragile economy threatened to collapse again with each setback. Still, for millions, the New Deal was proof that the government could be a force for hope and change, a lifeline in the storm. If you believe history like this should never be forgotten, support Epoch of Change by subscribing, liking, and sharing. Your encouragement helps us keep producing these deep, cinematic journeys into the past. The Great Depression was not just an economic catastrophe. It was a human experience etched into the faces, voices, and stories of millions. And in the darkest decade of the 20th century, art became both a witness and a weapon, recording suffering, stirring empathy, and reminding Americans of their own resilience. On the dusty roads of California, where migrant families trudged westward in search of survival, photographer Dorothea Lange carried her camera like a lantern. Commissioned by the Farm Security Administration, she documented the plight of those displaced by the Dust Bowl and the collapse of agriculture. One image in particular would come to define the era: Migrant Mother. A woman named Florence Owens Thompson gazes into the distance, her children clinging to her shoulders, their faces turned away in fear and fatigue. In her expression, weary, determined, unbreakable, millions saw themselves. Lange's photographs were more than art. They were pleas for compassion, evidence that suffering was not abstract, but vividly human. At the same time, a writer in California named John Steinbeck gave words to the voiceless. In 1939, he published The Grapes of Wrath, a novel that traced the fictional Joad family as they left their Oklahoma farm for the promise of California. Through their journey, the hunger, the rejection, the backbreaking labor in fields for pennies, Steinbeck captured the reality faced by thousands of Okies. His prose was raw and furious, condemning the cruelty of poverty while affirming the dignity of those who endured it. The book shocked the nation, won the Pulitzer Prize, and cemented its place as one of the greatest works of American literature. Music, too, carried the stories of the Depression. Woody Guthrie, a wandering folk singer with a guitar that bore the words, "This machine kills fascists," sang of dust storms, migrant camps, and the endless search for justice. His songs, "This Land Is Your Land," "Dust Bowl Refugee," became anthems for the displaced, sung around campfires and union halls alike. Guthrie's voice, plain and unpolished, carried the truth of the forgotten. He gave them a song when they had no platform, a melody when their words went unheard. Even Hollywood, which had thrived on escapism, found itself touched by the crisis. Musicals and comedies gave weary audiences a chance to laugh, but films like I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang and the Grapes of Wrath adaptation confronted the injustices of poverty and inequality directly. Stars like Shirley Temple brought light-hearted joy, while others used the screen to reflect the real struggles outside theater doors. The silver screen became both a mirror and a refuge. Art in the Depression was not an indulgence, it was survival. It gave Americans something beyond breadlines and bank failures, a sense of shared struggle, a reminder that even in despair, humanity endured. Photographs, novels, songs and films turned pain into permanence, ensuring that the voices of the poor and forgotten would echo long after the decade had ended. If you believe stories like these deserve to be remembered, subscribe to Epoch of Change. By supporting us, you help bring history's voices, from presidents to migrant mothers, back to life for new generations. All right, let's move into part 6 of your long-form cinematic documentary. This section will cover criticism, challenges, and the Second New Deal, Supreme Court fights, opposition from conservatives and radicals, Roosevelt's bold response. By the mid-1930s, Roosevelt's New Deal had reshaped America, but it had not silenced debate. For every family who found work in a WPA project or light from a TVA dam, there were critics who saw something else. A dangerous expansion of federal power, a reckless experiment that threatened the very fabric of American democracy. The New Deal was bold, but it was also fragile, caught between fierce opposition from conservatives on the right and radical reformers on the left. Business leaders accused Roosevelt of betraying capitalism. They warned that his regulations and taxes stifled investment, painting him as a traitor to his own class. The wealthy whispered bitterly about that man in the White House, while newspapers derided his programs as wasteful boondoggles. Wall Street, still suspicious of the government's hand, resisted his reforms, insisting that markets, not policies, should determine America's fate. At the same time, voices on the left insisted Roosevelt had not gone far enough. Huey Long, the flamboyant senator from Louisiana, captivated crowds with his fiery speeches demanding wealth redistribution under his Share Our Wealth plan. Father Charles Coughlin, a Catholic priest with a massive radio following, denounced bankers and called for radical monetary reform, his rhetoric blending populism with conspiracy. Labor leaders pressed for stronger protections, while socialist movements sought even deeper change. Roosevelt, caught between these forces, knew he had to adapt, or risk losing the faith of the people. The greatest challenge, however, came from the Supreme Court. In 1935, the court struck down key pillars of the New Deal, ruling the National Recovery Administration and the Agricultural Adjustment Act unconstitutional. To Roosevelt, it seemed the very guardians of the law were undermining his effort to save the nation. Furious but calculating, he unveiled a controversial plan in 1937 to expand the Supreme Court by adding new justices for every sitting justice over the age of 70. Critics immediately branded it a court-packing scheme, accusing Roosevelt of trying to bend the judiciary to his will. Even some of his supporters balked at the proposal, fearing it would tip America toward dictatorship. Though the plan failed, the pressure shifted the balance. Over time, the court became more favorable to Roosevelt's policies, allowing programs to survive and expand. And the New Deal's second wave pushed forward with renewed strength. The Wagner Act guaranteed workers the right to unionize and bargain collectively, fueling a surge in labor organizing across the country. The Works Progress Administration expanded, putting artists, teachers, and writers back to work alongside construction crews. Social security began to take root, offering a promise of dignity in old age. The Second New Deal was not without strain. Deficits grew, tensions deepened, and critics grew louder. But Roosevelt's vision held firm. The federal government, he insisted, had a responsibility to protect its citizens from the cruelties of chance and market collapse. To millions of ordinary Americans, the Second New Deal proved that Washington was not an enemy, but an ally, flawed, imperfect, but present. Still, storms lingered on the horizon. Unemployment remained high, farmers still struggled, and the specter of recession loomed. The New Deal had given hope, but had it truly solved the Depression? That question hung in the air, waiting for the next trial that history would deliver. If you believe history should always remind us of resilience in times of struggle, don't forget to subscribe to Epoch of Change. Like and share. It helps us bring more untold stories of humanity's greatest challenges to life. By 1937, it seemed the New Deal had lifted America from the edge of ruin. Banks were stabilized, millions had jobs, and confidence flickered where despair had once reigned. Roosevelt, re-elected in a landslide in 1936, stood as one of the most popular leaders in U.S. history. Yet beneath the surface, the economy remained fragile. Much of the recovery rested on government spending, and private investment still lagged. As Roosevelt sought to balance the budget and reduce deficits, a fateful decision loomed, one that would plunge the nation into yet another downturn. That year, in an effort to rein in costs, Roosevelt ordered deep cuts in federal spending, and the Federal Reserve tightened credit. The results were catastrophic. Factories slowed production, companies laid off workers, and unemployment surged once more. Between 1937 and 1938, the nation slipped into what became known as the Roosevelt recession. Stock prices tumbled, industrial production collapsed, and the fragile progress of the New Deal seemed to evaporate almost overnight. For Americans who had begun to believe the worst was over, the relapse was devastating. Roosevelt faced sharp criticism. Conservatives declared the recession proof that government intervention had failed. Liberals blamed him for cutting spending too soon. The Supreme Court battles over his court-packing plan still lingered, leaving his political capital strained. Congress, once a loyal partner, grew more cautious, and opposition stiffened on both sides of the aisle. The momentum of the New Deal, so strong in the early 1930s, began to falter under the weight of disillusionment. Yet even in the face of renewed crisis, Roosevelt adjusted. He pushed forward with more relief spending in 1938, reigniting programs under the WPA and expanding public works. Slowly, the economy regained its footing, but the lesson was clear. The Depression was not easily tamed. It remained a stubborn beast, resisting every cure. For ordinary Americans, the decade dragged on with hardship. Families lived with uncertainty, never knowing if jobs would last or savings would endure. The breadlines shortened, but they did not vanish. Rural poverty remained grinding. and racial inequities left Black Americans and other minorities disproportionately suffering. For many, the 1930s became a test of endurance rather than prosperity. And yet, the very act of survival in those years reshaped the national character. Americans adapted. They organized unions, demanded rights, and learned to lean on one another in ways that bound communities together. Churches, neighborhood groups, and local charities became lifelines. Families shared homes, food, and meager resources. Out of scarcity came solidarity, a recognition that endurance was not just personal, but collective. The Roosevelt recession reminded the nation that the path to recovery was jagged, filled with setbacks and disappointments. It also proved that leadership mattered, that when government stepped back, pain surged, and when it stepped forward, hope returned. Roosevelt himself admitted mistakes, but refused to abandon the people. His willingness to adapt, to bend without breaking, kept the flame of recovery alive, even if dim. If you believe stories of struggle and resilience should keep inspiring us today, subscribe to Epoch of Change, like and share this story to help us keep history's lessons alive for new generations. By the late 1930s, America remained haunted by uncertainty. The New Deal had brought hope, but the Depression still lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. Unemployment persisted, poverty endured, and confidence rose and fell with every shift in the economy. For a decade, Americans had fought through hunger, eviction, and despair. And then, as if history itself decided to intervene, the storm clouds of war gathered overseas, clouds that would change everything. In Europe, Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany, Benito Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy, and militarism in Japan signaled a new age of conflict. By 1939, the world plunged into war as German armies invaded Poland, and soon Britain and France stood in defiance. Across the Atlantic, Americans watched anxiously, torn between isolationism and a recognition that the global crisis might one day reach their shores. Though the United States remained officially neutral, war abroad meant opportunity at home. Allied nations, desperate for weapons and supplies, turned to American factories. Orders poured in for tanks, aircraft, rifles, and munitions. Slowly, production lines that had fallen silent during the Depression roared back to life. Shipyards filled with workers, steel mills rang with the sound of molten iron, and assembly lines that had once produced cars now rolled out bombers. Employment surged as industries expanded. Men who had stood idle for years now donned factory uniforms. Women, too, began to enter the workforce in greater numbers, foreshadowing the era of Rosie the Riveter. Paychecks flowed into households once crushed by debt. For the first time in a decade, Americans felt not just relief, but momentum. The Depression's grip was loosening, not because of policy alone, but because of global necessity. By 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor thrust the United States fully into World War II. Overnight, the nation mobilized on a scale never before seen. Millions enlisted, factories converted entirely to war production, and the government poured unprecedented sums into the economy. Within months, unemployment virtually disappeared. The specter of the Great Depression, which had haunted America for more than 10 years, was finally banished, not by gradual reform, but by the demands of total war. Yet this ending carried an irony. The Depression had revealed the vulnerabilities of capitalism, reshaped the relationship between government and citizens, and tested the endurance of the American people. But its final resolution came not through policy debates or social programs alone, but through the devastation of global conflict. War became the ultimate engine of recovery. As the nation armed itself and sent its sons overseas, Americans understood that the sacrifices of the 1930s had prepared them for the sacrifices of the 1940s. The endurance built in breadlines and dust storms now carried into battlefields and ration lines. The Great Depression had broken spirits, but it had also hardened resolve. If you believe history teaches us how resilience emerges from crisis, subscribe to Epoch of Change. Like and share this story so others can see how struggle transformed into strength. The Great Depression remains one of the most defining chapters in American history, not only because of the suffering it brought, but because of the transformation it forced. For more than a decade, Americans endured joblessness, hunger, displacement, and despair. They watched banks collapse, farms fail, families scatter, and dreams dissolve. Yet out of that crucible emerged a nation profoundly changed. Scarred, yes, but stronger and more aware of its collective power. The New Deal left an enduring legacy that still shapes the United States today. Programs like Social Security, born in the 1930s, continue to provide a safety net for millions of elderly and vulnerable citizens. The idea that government has a responsibility to protect the welfare of its people became a cornerstone of modern America. Federal agencies created in the New Deal era, from the SEC to the FDIC, remain pillars of economic stability, designed to prevent the same reckless speculation and collapse that had triggered the Depression. The physical legacy is also visible. Bridges, schools, parks, roads, and public buildings constructed under WPA projects still stand as monuments to resilience. Murals painted by artists, songs sung by folk musicians, and novels written during those years echo the voices of a generation that refused to be forgotten. But perhaps the greatest legacy lies in the lessons it left behind. The Depression taught Americans the fragility of prosperity and the danger of unchecked greed. It revealed how inequality and neglect could leave millions vulnerable when crisis strikes. It also proved that collective action, whether in unions, communities, or national policy, could blunt despair and foster hope. Even today, echoes of the Great Depression surface whenever economic turmoil strikes. In recessions, in debates about government spending, in arguments over social safety nets, the shadow of the 1930s still looms. The questions raised then about the balance between free markets and government intervention, about the responsibility of the state to its citizens, about how to preserve both liberty and security, remain alive. For those who lived it, the Depression was more than history. It was nights of hunger, winters without heat, journeys westward with hope packed into a single suitcase. It was the sight of a president's voice crackling through a radio, telling them they had nothing to fear but fear itself. It was endurance, and ultimately it was survival. The Great Depression ended, but its memory endures, a reminder that even in the darkest of hours, a nation can bend without breaking. From breadlines to battlefields, from despair to determination, the 1930s forged a generation that would go on to defeat fascism abroad and build a new world at home. If you believe stories like these deserve to be remembered and retold, subscribe to Epoch of Change. Like and share this journey so that history's hardest lessons are never lost and its deepest triumphs continue to inspire us today.